So last weekend, my uncle and I, we decided to go out and we were going to go up on this mountain and we were going to photograph some cool landscapes. He also wanted to learn how to better utilize his camera by shooting in manual mode. Well, unfortunately for us, when we arrived at the mountain, a tree had fallen, blocking off the main path, so we didn't get to make it all the way to the top. We did manage to get to stop and get a few shots, as you can see here. I was overall happy with those, but, I would like to have been able to have done a lot more. Now, one thing he wanted to learn more about on this trip was manual mode photography and how to get more control over his camera. Unfortunately, it was like 40 degrees outside, and with the breeze blowing beside of this creek, it was just intolerable, and that was not the best place to be learning that. So I thought for today's video, maybe we could go over manual exposure in more of a brief setting to kind of give you an idea of what each piece of the manual exposure triangle does, what that is, and how you can better utilize your camera in a manual setting. But with that out of the way, let's talk about manual exposure, why you want to use it, how to utilize it, and what all these different terms actually mean. So when a camera is actually exposing for a scene, even in automatic mode, there are three main components that's being used to make this overall exposure. And those are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And the three of these things together make up something that we like to call an exposure triangle. And once you properly balance out that triangle, that's when you create a well-exposed image. But before we talk about how to figure them out and combine them together, let's explain what each one of these things are so you get a better understanding of what you're changing and why you're changing it. So the first thing we want to talk about is called ISO. And back in the old days of film photography, you used to get film that would be ISO 100, 200, 400, 800. They came in variable forms. And any of those of you out there that know about film photography, you might remember this, and you might just remember, oh, well, I bought ISO 200 if I was shooting outdoor stuff, and I got 400 or 800 if I was shooting indoor stuff, and that's pretty much all I know about it. So what it refers to is the sensitivity to, in that case, film, or in our case, how sensitive the sensor is to the light hitting it. So basically, the smaller the ISO number, the less sensitive the light it is, and the less grain or digital noise you're going to notice in something. Or with the higher number of ISO, the more grain or digital noise that you're going to see. So for example, in this scene, if I did not have all these lights, I would probably be shooting at ISO 800 or above. You would see a lot of grain, more so than what is in the video now, and it just wouldn't look very flattering at all. So to control that, what I've done is exposed a little better with my aperture and shutter speed, as well as added in some lights to compensate. But unfortunately, there are some scenarios where you're going to have to bump up that ISO to compensate for things. So maybe if you're at a really dark concert, or you're photographing a play, or some outdoor photos like street photography, there are situations where you have to bump it up, and there are situations where that added noise and grain can be okay in an artistic kind of way. Now, the second thing we want to learn about today is probably one of the simplest ones of all, and that is shutter speed. And essentially what shutter speed is just how fast your shutter opens and closes. The amount of time that you allow light to enter into your camera and hit the sensor. I like to think about a water hose analogy. When you pull back the trigger on the water hose to spray your friend or significant other in the face with water, how long that you allow yourself to do that is your shutter speed. Shutter speed is the primary source that we use to control motion. So if you want to show motion in your photographs, you want to use a slower shutter speed like a 60, a 30, maybe a half a second or a full second or even longer. But if you want to stop that motion, you want to use faster shutter speeds. So say maybe 250, 500, 1,000. So if you're shooting a football game and there's a lot of action, a lot of people running and going wild, you want to use a faster shutter speed so you can freeze that moment in time. You don't want the person to be out of focus or blurry because you shot at a slow shutter speed and now it's just a big blur, because that's an unusable image. So if you want to freeze that person, shoot at a faster shutter speed. Because these numbers aren't just like 500, 1000. These numbers are actually fractions. So it's 1 over 500, 1 over 1000, because it is 1/1000th of a second that your shutter is opening and closing, just like that. Whereas a half a second is like that. So you get literally a half a second that the shutter is open, allowing light to come in, and that's essentially shutter speed. Now, the last piece of our exposure triangle, and one of most everybody's favorites, is the aperture. Aperture can seem a little confusing at times because it's typically classified by something we call an F number or an f-stop. So you might see this funky looking little F here with like a 2.8 or a 5.6 or an 11 or some other number in front of it. And that may not seem like it makes much sense at all, but over time it really will. The smaller the number with an aperture, the larger the opening is. So if you have an f2.0 like I do right now, my aperture looks something like this. I mean, maybe it's not quite that big, but it's really wide open. Versus if I were to set my aperture to an f22, it's going to be super tiny, kind of like that of a pinhole on the front of like a ballpoint pen, because it becomes more narrow because it allows more, less light to come into the lens. So with the water hose analogy we used with shutter speed being how long you actually spray the person in the face, aperture is more like how far back you pull the trigger, how much water you let come out of that hose. Well, in this case, how much light are you letting come into the lens in that given time that you're opening it up. So for example, if you want a really shallow depth of field, you're going to use a wide open aperture, which is the big open one. It's a faster speed, which we'll get into that later as well. But like an f2.8, an f1.8, an f2, it's really going to shallow up that depth of field. Like for now, I'm using an f2, so you'll see that some of the background in this scene is somewhat blurry. It would be even more blurry if I could increase my aperture more, but f2.0 is the widest open aperture that I have. Now, if you want images to be a lot sharper and you want to be able to express scenes a lot better overall, everything's in tack point focus, you might want to use something like f11 to f16 or even f22. Everything's going to be in focus and you really don't have a depth of field at that point. It's not really shallow at that point. It's very wide open. So basically with aperture, there's two things you're thinking about. How much light you're allowing to come in the camera overall as soon as that lens opens up, and how do you want your depth of field to be. But now how do you put all three of these things together to create an exposure? Well, let's talk about that. So what I'm going to try to do is give you a couple of scenarios to explain how this works. And one of the easiest scenarios, at least for me and my uncle that day we were out hiking, was this. If you're out in bright sunlight, you're probably safe at setting your ISO to 100 and just leaving it there. And you're pretty much set at that point. Now, if you don't have a tripod and you're doing everything handheld, you want to make sure your shutter speed is somewhere that it's safe to hold handheld. And I wouldn't recommend anything at 60th of a second or below. So let's say your shutter speed you're going to set to 1/25th of a second. That's a pretty safe spot to still handhold your images. Now you have to worry about your aperture. And one way to determine if you're getting your exposure set correctly, at least in the easiest form, is when you're looking on the back of your LCD screen, or preferably through your viewfinder, you're going to notice there's this little kind of like bar section here. It looks like a little cityscape. And you're going to notice there's another little thing that's going to move around. This often used to be called the needle, at least in film photography. And what you want to do is right in the center, you're going to see a 0. When you have your ISO and shutter speed set, you need to move your aperture around so that little needle fits right there at the 0 mark, because that's going to get you a neutral exposure. Now, there are some cases where you may want that needle to move one stop above and overexpose just slightly, especially if it's a darker scene. Or you might want to underexpose the image a little bit, especially if you're showing a sky in the background, because that way you could still pull up some details from your shadow areas, but you don't blow out your sky scene. So what I recommend for you to do is to do this. When you go out and shoot in manual mode, figure out what kind of scene you're in and what kind of ISO will work. Remember, bright light and like sunny days, ISO 100 to maybe 200 is going to work just fine. And then set yourself a shutter speed. Are you shooting handheld? What type of things are you shooting? Maybe 1/25th of a second would work for more still life stuff. But if you're shooting stuff with more action, maybe 250th of a second or 500 would be good. Just go ahead and get those two things dialed in. Then mess around with your aperture to determine what's going to make a proper exposure by getting that needle right at the 0 line. Once you do that, you'll start to learn how these things work and how they're interchangeable. If you'd prefer to have control over your depth of field versus the shutter speed, I recommend setting in your ISO and then your aperture and then moving your shutter speed around to compensate. So there's different situations we might want to do these things. So if you're taking a portrait, for example, concentrate on the aperture. Set your aperture to an f2.8, get your ISO at 100, and then move your shutter speed to account accordingly. If you're out in broad daylight shooting at 100 ISO with an aperture of f2.8, your shutter speed's probably going to be like 1/1000th, 1/2000th, or 1/500th at the very least, because if that bright daylight's coming in, your shutter's going to have to open really quick because that aperture is allowing so much light to come into the camera. But just go out and experiment with those different things and see how it works best for you. Now again, if you want to learn more about this, I am going to have a full course on Skillshare that's going to go way more in depth. That link is in my description box below. You get 2 months free on Skillshare, including getting to see the class I already have up, and you'll be able to watch this one as soon as it goes live in the next like 5 days or so. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you have any questions whatsoever concerning manual photography or any of the things I mentioned in this video, leave that in the comment section below and I'll help you out the best way that I can. If you want to see more videos like this or any of the other stuff that I've been creating on photography or the Canon M50, be sure to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. But most importantly of all, be sure to create something new today.